The bar counter, Friday night, 1973. The landlord's pulling a pint. And there's something on that counter, right there at eye level, that you haven't thought about in 40 years. But you can picture it right now. Number 12 on this list sold for threepence in every pub in Britain, and vanished from every bar counter in the country within 18 months of one single government decision. Number 7 was made fresh every morning by the landlord's wife, and hasn't been seen behind a British bar since 1981. And number 1, the pub snack that sat on more bar counters than any other in the 1970s, is the one your generation reached for without even thinking about it. The generation after yours has never once seen it in a pub. These are 15 forgotten British pub snacks from the 1970s that have completely disappeared. And if you remember what that bar counter looked like on a Friday night, this one is for you. Number 15. Loose salted peanuts in a bowl. Not a packet, not a bag hung on a card rack. A bowl. A plain ceramic bowl, sometimes chipped at the rim, always slightly greasy, sitting on the bar counter filled with salted peanuts that had been tipped in from a catering tin at the start of the session, and sat there all evening for anyone to help themselves. Free. Just there. Because the salt made you thirsty and the thirst sold beer, and everybody understood this arrangement without needing it explained. The bowl of loose peanuts on the British bar counter in the early 1970s was as standard as the drip tray and the ashtray. It was part of the furniture. A catering tin of Planters salted peanuts in 1972 cost around 2 shillings and sixpence, and kept the bowl filled for a full Friday and Saturday session combined. Then food hygiene research arrived. Studies in the late 1970s found that the average loose peanut bowl, who had visited the gents without washing their hands adequately. The research was published. The newspapers ran it. The bowls disappeared from bar counters within months, not by law, by shame. The free peanut bowl is gone. The thirst it created is gone. And something unrepeatable about the casual generosity of the 1970s pub went with it. But what replaced it on that bar counter was something even more specifically British. Number 14. Smith's crisps in the old bag, with the little blue salt twist. Not Walker's, not any of the flavoured varieties that came later. The original Smith's crisps, plain, in a white waxed paper bag, with a small twist of blue paper inside containing loose salt that you shook in yourself, and then twisted the top of the bag closed and shook it to distribute the salt before you opened it and ate them. That ritual. The twist of blue paper, the shaking, the opening. Every person over 60 who grew up going to the pub with their parents on a Sunday lunchtime can feel that blue paper twist between their fingers right now. Smith's crisps were the original British crisp, founded in 1920, and by 1974 selling around 48 million bags a week across Britain. In a pub in 1971, a bag cost around threepence halfpenny. They were not a luxury, they were just crisps. But they were the crisps, and the blue salt twist was inseparable from them. Walker's bought Smith's in 1989 and gradually phased out the separate salt sachet in favour of pre-salted crisps. The blue twist disappeared from pub bars in the early 1990s, a small thing, an enormous loss. Because what went with the blue twist was the participation, the small act of seasoning your own food at the bar that made a 3-penny bag of crisps feel like a choice rather than a transaction. We're at number 14. The snacks get more specific from here, and number 11 is the one that will stop most people cold. Number 13, pickled eggs from the jar on the bar. The jar, always on the bar, always slightly cloudy with the vinegar that had been in it since the landlord's wife topped it up last Tuesday. Large white eggs, hard-boiled, shelled, submerged in malt vinegar with peppercorns and sometimes a bay leaf floating at the top. Sitting in that jar at room temperature. Available for a penny or tuppence each. Lifted out with a long-handled fork by the landlord when you asked for one. Eaten standing at the bar. No plate, no napkin. Just the egg in your hand and a pint alongside it, and the sharp, acidic smell of the vinegar cutting through the fog of cigarette smoke. The pickled egg jar was a fixture of the British working-class pub from roughly the late Victorian era through to the 1980s. In the pit villages of Yorkshire and the dock towns of the Mersey and the steel communities of South Wales, the pickled egg was as much a part of the pub as the dartboard. A dozen eggs cost around 2 shillings to pickle at home in 1970. The jar lasted weeks if the turnover was slow. Food safety regulations tightened through the 1980s and 1990s. The unrefrigerated jar of eggs sitting at room temperature behind a bar failed every new hygiene standard that arrived. Landlords were told to refrigerate them or remove them. Most removed them. The jar went, and the penny egg went with it. And yet, the next item on this list sat right alongside that jar on thousands of British bar counters, and nobody ever questioned it for a moment. Number 12. Loose tobacco and cigarette papers on the bar counter. This is the one. The government decision. The 18 months. In the early 1970s, many British pubs, particularly working-class locals in the North and the Midlands, kept a small supply of loose pipe tobacco and cigarette papers. On or behind the bar counter for sale, not a full tobacconist's range, just the basics. Half an ounce of Golden Virginia or Condor in a paper twist for a few pence. This was not a formal retail operation. It was the pub functioning as the community resource it had always been, the place that had what you needed when everywhere else was closed. In 1973, a half ounce of Golden Virginia bought loose behind a bar cost around 3p, against 6p or 7p at the tobacconist. The government's decision was the Tobacco Products Duty Act 1976 and its subsequent retail licensing requirements. Pubs selling tobacco needed to register as tobacco retailers and comply with new regulations. Most small landlords decided it wasn't worth the paperwork. The loose tobacco behind the bar disappeared in most pubs between 1976 and 1978, exactly 18 months from regulation to absence. Not banned, just made inconvenient enough that it stopped. That's how most things on this list ended, not with a law, but with a form. We haven't reached the top 10 yet, and the snacks that defined the pub counter, most specifically, the ones with the most direct line to the Britain your generation actually remembers, those are still ahead. Number 11. Arrowroot Biscuits in the glass jar, behind the bar, not on it. On the shelf behind the bar, alongside the bottles of Advocaat and Cherry B, and the ancient bottle of Tia Maria that nobody ever ordered. A large glass sweet jar, the same kind that lived in the penny sweet shop, filled with plain arrowroot biscuits. Pale, slightly dusty looking. Sold 3 for a penny to the children who came in with their parents on Sunday lunchtimes and sat in the corner with a bottle of Vimto while the adults had their drinks. Arrowroot biscuits in 1972 were considered suitable for children because they were bland and digestible and contained nothing that would excite them or cause difficulty. They were what you gave a child who needed something to do with their hands while the adults talked. They were not exciting. They were not meant to be exciting. They were meant to keep a child quiet for 45 minutes in a pub corner on a Sunday lunchtime, and they did this with complete reliability. The glass jar behind the bar was a specific piece of pub infrastructure that existed to manage the presence of children in an environment not designed for them. When pubs began building proper family rooms in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the jar became redundant. And when the jar went, the arrowroot biscuit went with it, because nobody ever bought arrowroot biscuits for any other reason. Number 10. Pork scratchings, the proper ones. Not the supermarket bag, not the pub chain brand in the foil packet. The proper ones, made locally, delivered weekly, hung on a small wire rack on or near the bar counter in a bag that was slightly translucent with grease. And that weighed considerably more than any modern pork scratching has ever weighed. Because the proper ones had a layer of fat under the crackling that the modern version has processed out of existence. The sound of them, that crack when you bit through the hard outer skin and hit the soft fat beneath. That specific combination of textures, the almost tooth-breaking outer layer and the yielding interior, that is what a proper pork scratching was and what no modern version has replicated. In the pubs of the Black Country and the West Midlands in the 1970s, pork scratchings were not a snack. They were a serious food group, made by local butchers from pig skin and back fat, delivered fresh to individual pubs that had standing weekly orders. In 1975, a bag cost around 4p from the bar. The National Health Campaign against saturated fat in the early 1980s did not kill pork scratchings. They survived that. What killed the proper version was standardization. The large snack manufacturers took over the market in the mid-1980s with a nationally consistent product that had lower fat content and longer shelf life. The local butcher's batch delivery stopped because it couldn't compete on price. The proper scratching went with it. We are at number 10. The top half of this list is done. And what's coming in the bottom half is what the bar counter looked like at its most specific, at its most 1970s, at its most irretrievably gone. Stop here for a moment, because there is something about every snack on this list so far that connects them all, and that nobody ever talks about directly. Every single one of them existed not because pubs planned to sell food, but because pubs were the living room of working-class Britain, and a living room provides what its occupants need. The bowl of peanuts because salt sells beer. The pickled egg because a man finishing a late shift needed something in his stomach before the walk home. The biscuits because the children needed managing. The crisps because Smith's had been supplying British pubs since 1920 and the relationship was older than anyone behind the bar. The pub snack in 1970 was not a profit centre. It was not a menu item. It was not a revenue stream. It was just what was on the counter because the counter was where people stood, and people who stand for 3 hours need something to pick at. The moment pub companies began treating snacks as a revenue opportunity, which happened through the late 1980s and 1990s. As the large pub chains replaced individual landlords, everything on this list was evaluated for margin and found wanting. The pickled egg jar failed the hygiene audit. The loose peanut bowl failed the contamination test. The locally made scratching failed the price comparison. And the bar counter that had been a community resource became a retail display. What was lost was not the food, it was the principle. The idea that the pub owed its regulars something beyond what they paid for at the till. That principle is gone as completely as every snack on this list. The next 5 items are the ones that defined the specific texture of the 1970s pub counter. And number 1, when we get there, will close every loop this list has opened. Number 9, cheese and onion crisps. The Smith's hexagonal bag. Not the same as number 14. Different product, different era, different bag. By the mid-1970s, Smith's had introduced flavoured crisps in a hexagonal bag, a 6-sided design that was distinctively different from the rectangular bags of the competition. And that sat in the rack behind the bar in a way that made them visible from further away than any other crisp product. Cheese and onion was the flavour that defined the British pub crisp rack in the mid-1970s. Not plain, not ready salted. Cheese and onion. That specific, slightly artificial, intensely savoury smell that hit you when you opened the bag. And that, combined with the cigarette smoke and the beer, to create the olfactory signature of a 1975 Friday night that no other combination of sensory elements can replicate. A hexagonal bag of Smith's cheese and onion in 1975 cost around 5p from the pub rack. The hexagonal bag was discontinued in the late 1970s when Walker's standardized packaging became the industry norm, following their regional expansion. The bag shape seems like a trivial detail. It isn't. The bag shape was the brand recognition from across the bar. When it went, something visible and specific about that pub counter went with it. Number 8. Twiglets from the bowl. Not always in a bag, sometimes in a bowl. Like the peanuts, put out at the start of the session, in a plain ceramic bowl for people to help themselves. The particular smell of Twiglets, that Marmite-coated wheat snack that divided absolutely everyone who encountered it, into passionate advocates and people who couldn't understand why anyone would eat something that smelled like that, was a constant in certain pubs throughout the 1970s. Twiglets were made by Peak Friends and had existed since 1929, but reached their 1970s pub peak when the company began marketing them specifically to the pub trade as a complement to beer. The slight bitterness of the Marmite coating cut through the sweetness of bitter and lager in a way that plain crisps didn't, and that made them genuinely functional as a drinking accompaniment rather than just a snack. In 1974, a large catering bag of Twiglets cost around 1 6p wholesale. Put in a bowl on the counter, they cost the landlord almost nothing per customer and generated conversation. Because Twiglets always generated conversation. You either loved them or you were wrong, and both sides were very clear on this point. The bowl version went with the hygiene regulations. The bag version survived and is still available. But something about Twiglets from a bowl in a pub in 1974 that tasted different from Twiglets from a supermarket bag today. And it isn't the product that changed. Number 7. The landlord's wife's sandwiches, made fresh, every morning, without exception, without a menu, without a price list on a chalkboard, because the price was whatever it had always been and everyone knew it. She'd come down at 9, open the bread from the bakery that delivered at 8:30, butter it with proper butter, not spread, fill it with whatever was in the kitchen. Cold beef from Sunday's joint on a Monday, cheese and pickle on a Tuesday, egg mayonnaise when eggs were cheap, ham when the housekeeping stretched. Cut each sandwich in half diagonally, wrap it in greaseproof paper, and put the stack on a plate on the end of the bar with a handwritten card in front saying what was in them. A sandwich in 1973 from the landlord's wife cost around fourpence. Not the gastropub sandwich of today at £8.50. Fourpence for 2 triangles wrapped in greaseproof paper that she'd made at 9 o'clock that morning from the bread that came at 8:30. The tied house system began its accelerated decline through the 1970s as large brewery groups rationalised their pub estates. Managed houses replaced tenancies. Professional managers replaced landlord couples who had lived above the pub for 30 years. The manager had no wife making sandwiches at 9 in the morning because the manager didn't live there and his wife had her own job. By 1981, the last of these sandwiches had gone from most British pubs, not replaced by anything. Just gone. The landlord's wife's sandwich has not been on a British bar counter since, and it will never be again. But the next item on this list was made by someone else entirely and lasted slightly longer. Number 6. Scotch eggs from the glass dome on the bar. Scratched and slightly cloudy from years of being lifted and replaced. Underneath it, Scotch eggs, made in the pub kitchen or delivered daily from a local butcher, sitting on a plain white plate under the dome to keep the flies off and the warmth in. A Scotch egg in a 1970s pub was not the artisanal heritage product it became in gastropubs 40 years later. It was a hard-boiled egg wrapped in sausage meat, coated in breadcrumbs, deep-fried, cut in half and served on a plate with a blob of Coleman's mustard for 6pence or 7pence at the bar. The glass dome was the specific piece of pub infrastructure. It sat alongside the pickled egg jar and the sandwich plate, and the pork-scratching rack as part of the bar counter's food offer. An offer that was entirely informal, entirely non-menu, entirely based on what the landlord or his wife had made or bought that morning. Health regulations in the early 1980s required food kept for sale to be maintained at specific temperatures. A Scotch egg under a glass dome at room temperature failed this requirement. Refrigerated display units were the compliant alternative. Most small landlords could not afford the units and stopped selling Scotch eggs entirely. The glass dome went. The Scotch egg survived in packets. It is not the same thing, and everyone who ate from under that dome knows it. Number 5. Peanuts on a card. The reveal card. This one specifically. Not loose peanuts, not bagged peanuts. The peanut card. A printed card mounted on the wall or hung from the bar, covered with small cellophane-wrapped portions of salted peanuts. As customers bought packets and removed them from the card, the picture beneath was gradually revealed. Sometimes a pin-up, sometimes a cartoon. The peanut reveal card was a genuine phenomenon in British pubs in the 1970s. It was sold to landlords as a promotional tool. A packet on the card in 1974 cost around 4pence. The cards were supplied by KP Nuts and Golden Wonder, among others. The Equal Opportunities Commission raised objections. The cards were redesigned with inoffensive images and quietly disappeared by the early 1980s. Number 4. Bovril in a cup from behind the bar. Cold night. Winter. 1971. You've come in from outside and the cold is still in your coat. And instead of another pint, you ask the landlord for a Bovril. Hot water from the urn, a heaped teaspoon of Bovril stirred into it. The dark, savoury steam rising before you'd even got it to the bar. 3pence in 1970, 4pence by 1975. The cheapest warm thing you could buy. In the northern pubs, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, where winter was genuinely cold, the Bovril served a function beyond flavour. Central heating ended it. By 1980, asking for a Bovril had become the kind of request that made the barmaid look at you slightly sideways. Number 3. Arrowroot biscuits wrapped individually. The barmaid's drawer. Different from the jar version. Older, more specifically working class. To the older regular who came in every night and who the barmaid knew hadn't eaten. To the man who'd had one too many. This was not a commercial transaction. It was the pub functioning as its community had always needed it to function. Until it stopped happening when the managed house model arrived with its staff training manuals and its absolute clarity of the till. Number 2. Crisps hung on a wire rack, the full rack, not a display stand, a wire rack, homemade almost. The wire rack was not designed, it evolved. Each pub's rack was slightly different height, different capacity. The full rack on a Thursday afternoon, before the weekend rush had depleted it, was a particular sight. Every hook occupied. By the mid-1980s, branded display units had replaced the wire rack. The era of the multi-brand wire rack ended. Number 1. The glass jar of sweets on the bar. For the children, this is the one. The snack that sat on more British bar counters than any other, filled with wrapped sweets, barley sugars, humbugs, sold to the children. Penny for 2, penny for 3, depending on the sweet. The jar was the signal that this was a pub that understood families, that children were tolerated here and even welcomed. When the last landlords, who had always just done it, retired in the late 1980s, the jar went with them. Not removed, just not replaced. The jar on the bar counter. The signal that the pub knew who its community was. That is what no British pub today has found a way to replicate.